Good evening, everybody. It is a pleasure to welcome you back to another episode of Learning with My Rabbis. Today we have a very, very special guest who's not officially a rabbi, but she's a rabbi in every sense of the word, of a teacher. Marion Haberman, I've known her since my days way back when at Camp J.C. Shalom in Malibu, and she's come a long way since then. Marion is a writer and content creator for the most popular mommy YouTube channel focused on being a Jewish mom. She has over 4 million total views on her YouTube channel, and she's also on Instagram where she shares her experiences as a Jewish mother focused on living a meaningful Jewish family life. And she's just recently come out with a new book, Expecting Jewish, a Millennial Mom's Practical Guide to How Judaism Can Be a Blessing for New Moms and Moms-to-Be, which I highly recommend. We'll get into that in just a little bit. And Marion, it is really a pleasure to have you with us on the program.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to chat with you and get on with this discussion. So thank you so much for having me.
So usually I start off asking people how they came to the rabbinate. But for you, my question is, you have this online name. You go by My Jewish Mommy Life is your platform. So how did all that begin? How did you get into this?
Well, it's funny that that's your first question because I really considered going to rabbinical school when I was thinking about this. So basically, I've always been in the entertainment world. I worked for television studios and that kind of thing. And I was watching a lot of YouTube for my job at the time. And I just sort of fell in love. And then I got pregnant and was watching all these moms on YouTube. And I was obsessed with their content, how to design a nursery, how to pack a hospital bag. I was like researching and prepping everything. And then it came close to when my baby was due, and I started researching how to plan a bris. And I realized that there were no Jewish moms on YouTube. And if you search bris, there would be maybe like some informational content from Chabad or something like that, but none of that real world, this is what you wear, this is when you feed the baby, like all those little details that moms really appreciate. And for me, and in this day and age, a lot of women, the first bris that they'll go to will be their own sons. So it's really nice. What's nice about YouTube is everything, anything under the sun, you can see how a real person does it. But I realized there was this lack of content from a real Jewish mom's perspective. So that's when I had the idea that maybe this could be something I could do, that I could make YouTube videos about my life as a Jewish mom. But I had a little bit of imposter syndrome, which I'm sure everyone does when you start out on a creative journey. And I was thinking, well, I'm not an expert. I'm not a rabbi. Should I go to rabbinical school? Should I get a master's in Jewish education? And then I realized that what's so unique about YouTube and social media in general is that the people who have followings and who people love to follow along with their everyday life are not the people who have the most degrees or the most amount of information, but the people who just share the raw, real journeys. And I realized that if I became a rabbi, it might not even help with my YouTube channel, that because people really just wanted to see an everyday real Jewish mom. So that's where the idea was born. It took me probably another year until I actually felt confident to put up videos. But yeah, that's how it all started. I still love Jewish learning, and I do have a strong Jewish educational background, which I'm very thankful for. And I always there's always more to learn, but mostly I'm sharing my everyday real experiences as a real person. Not that rabbis aren't real. You guys are just super special.
I think that authenticity goes a long way. I know growing up, there's the model of the rabbi was kind of 24/7, this rabbinic figure, this kind of separate from the community, versus now I think a lot of rabbis, the style is more to share some of themselves with their communities, especially in the non-Orthodox world. And at least I know for me, I found that to be a more successful way of connecting. That authenticity, I think, really resonates with people.
For sure.
But it's funny to me that you had this imposter syndrome. I know many rabbis who go through that. I won't put myself on the spot here, but many rabbis who have felt that way at one time or another, at least in their first few years. But even back when we were at Camp J.C. Shalom, you were like one of the rabbinic figures there, even as a camper and staff member, where you were leading services and helping to, right, bring kind of Jewish life to others in a very meaningful way. I know for me, that was a big
Yeah.
part of my own Jewish journey was summer camp. I'm curious a little bit how that affected you, but also just, right, you had these experiences even back then as a teacher and bringing Judaism alive to the people around you. So
Yeah,
how did
it's
camp influence your Jewish journey?
So I had a really strong, Jewish background. I went to day school and had a lot of Jewish learning. And I would say that JCA was less religious than my family or Jewish experience. And for me, Judaism had always been this blessing, this something in my life that helped me. And a lot of the kids that came to JCA had no real Jewish education or even Jewish experience more than like celebrating Hanukkah. And what I saw was like, I wanted to give this gift to them that, I was their counselor for a few weeks and they were at a Jewish camp. And I wanted to make sure that I could kind of share my love and gift with them while they were there. So it was like natural. I was just like, can we do this at services? Can we add in this education? I was so passionate about it. And there was no, end goal. I wasn't trying to get anywhere with it or go any, like get ahead in any way. It was just this genuine, like, these kids have to know, they got to know so that they can hold on to this their whole life long, because for a lot of them, this would be their fundamental and maybe only Jewish experience.
I love that answer. I know for me, I noticed when I was in university, so many of my classmates, I was in a Jewish fraternity, and there were just a couple of us that kept kosher. And even for us, it was, kosher meat. We didn't have separate dishes and things like that in university. And a couple of us went to Shabbat or holidays at the synagogue. Everyone else, Judaism was about culture. There was not much about the religion. But I felt very lucky. I had a couple of teachers and experiences growing up that made Judaism, I love the way you described it, a blessing. They made it meaningful in my life. Versus so many of my peers, they saw Judaism as a burden, something that prevented them from living life the way they wanted.
Mhm.
And I think for me, it's something I've always tried to do is to be someone that helps to bring people in that aren't necessarily already finding that meaning, finding that connection, as opposed to there are certainly rabbis and teachers for people that are already deep and steeped in the tradition and life. Is that how you view yourself, as someone to bring in people that don't have a lot of background? Or do you see also for people that do have strong kind of connections and backgrounds?
I think it's a combination. If you look at the comments on my video, something I never expected was that a lot of people who are interested in converting to Judaism watch my channel, which makes sense because, if you're going to light Shabbat candles for the first time and you don't want to do it wrong, you want to see like how a real person really does it. So I have so many people who have started on their conversion journey through watching my videos, which is amazing and something I did not have in mind when I started the channel. But there's also a huge group of people who write to me and tell me that their grandparents, celebrated holidays with them, but that was their only Jewish experience. Or even if they do have a strong Jewish upbringing, but, in their modern grown up adult life, they don't have time to incorporate it. So there really is a mixture. And I think that, like you said, my goal is the same, to show that Judaism can be a helpful blessing and not a burden, no matter what path you're on, no matter how it fits into your life, no matter how you feel about God and traditions. There's always an aspect that can be helpful for you, even if you know nothing and even if you have very little experience. So I've found that that's resonated a lot with the people who watch my content.
One of the sermon ideas I've been bouncing around in my head is I really want to do a sermon titled Guilt, Why the World Needs More Jewish Mothers. And I think it's different than, right, the sense of shame, which I think it's good the world's moved past that, but I think people need a sense of responsibility for their actions, which I think is being lost in the world. But I'm curious, just with your perspective, do you think Judaism's helped you to be a better mother in ways? Or do you think, right, the right way of saying it, I guess it's a Venn diagram. I'll let you answer the question. How has Judaism impacted, do you think, your ability as a mom?
Yeah, I think it's had a huge impact. I actually just put up a video about do Jewish parents spank their kids and, why it's sort of very rare, especially in the Jewish circles I grew up in Los Angeles, that Jewish parents would parent in that way. And I talked about how there's this real fundamental basis from the Torah, from the beginning, that children are viewed as a blessing and that throughout their lives, it's our responsibility to guide them, to teach them, and the way that that impacts our parenting style is huge. So I think for me, yes, definitely Judaism has had an effect, and I want my children to grow up to be mensches, to have good Jewish values. So every experience that we have with them, whether it's, picking up a piece of trash and connecting it to Tikkun Olam, it's like there's always this bigger Jewish value kind of guiding what we do. So, yeah, on the one to one aspect, it guides how I parent, how I'm patient with my kids, how I, am able to not get too upset at them or, to calm down, to be patient with them. And then on the bigger scale, and how I'm raising them to have confidence in themselves and to be guided by Jewish values. So I think I'm sure that other cultures, also have many wonderful aspects to bring to raising a child, but that throughout Judaism, commandment number one, be fruitful and multiply. It's like it's such a huge part of our culture, and it's such a, I think, wonderfully valued part of our culture to see that raising children is so important. So, absolutely.
Especially today, where in the olden days, I think a lot of cultures and societies, families stuck very closely together. But we see the American dream of the nuclear family. But I think Judaism forces us to go a little bit beyond that and stay connected to the parents and grandparents and cousins, and there's I think, a stronger sense. And it's certainly true that that exists in other cultures as well. But I think as a whole, in the zeitgeist in America, it's certainly less and less so, the reliance on extended family.
Yeah, and actually, that reminds me in the video, I also talk about that a lot of Jewish adults are very close to their parents, and it's kind of like a joke, that they never fully separate. But what's wonderful about the way Jewish culture tends to raise children is to form a loving bond with their parents so that when they're older, you still have those connections to grandparents, which play such a vital role for the next generation.
So I'm just thinking, as your audience maybe ages up, someday you'll have to write the book for millennials for how to care for their own parents someday, because that's something as well that our tradition puts a strong emphasis on, the responsibility kids have for parents. And someday the parents of all the kids that you're writing to, or you're writing to their parents now, they're going to be grown up, and we have to address what their role is for their own folk.
Right. And it's sort of the antithesis of like the me, myself, and I generation that, well, our parents, did us wrong or, do, aren't there for us 100% in the way that we want them to be. So we need to cut them out. There's a lot of that going on in the zeitgeist as well. And I think Judaism's take is like, let's honor the generation that came before us. Let's forgive the wrongs that they might have committed and, try to find a way to bridge those gaps, for the sake of the community and continuity and the family and all of that. It's really interesting because, yeah, I feel like there's a lot of that going on right now.
One of the things you just mentioned, right? Sometimes kids think, right, my parents weren't perfect. And I have a lot of parents who struggle with the idea of they're not perfect, especially in this world today. We see it just with, you're home on the weekend watching TV or Netflix, and you're scrolling through your Instagram or Facebook, and everyone's, at a resort, or they're traveling the world, they're flying first class, and when everyone puts up their best face online. And I'm not a parent yet, but from the parents I've talked to, there's a lot of pressure when they see things online of, right, the moms that sort the kids' meals every day and plan out the whole week, or cut the bread into this shape and the fruit into that shape and create a little flower. And I guess my question is, what's your advice to moms or parents that struggle with that idea of, right, they're not perfect, that they need to do more?
Totally. Well, I think those social pressures are very true and very hard, especially for new parents. But one thing I want to talk about is the idea of like a parent never messing up. And something that, happened recently that I spoke about on my Instagram was my son was really upset and he said, Mommy, you're hurting my feelings. And it really frustrated me because I wasn't doing anything. Like he said it, because he knew that that would upset me. And my instant reaction was to defend myself, to say, no, that's not right. And in the moment, what I reminded myself was it's more important that he feels confident in himself to share his feelings and to talk to me than that he thinks I'm always right. Because the goal of parenting is not to convince your children that you're always right and you're perfect. It's to convince them that you're always there for them. At least that's how I do it. So what I wanted him to see in that moment was that I'm not going to be scared of his big feelings and I'm going to be there for him no matter what. And if that means saying, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, even though I don't want to in that moment, then that's what I'm going to do. So that I think is also a very important lesson on the topic of perfection. And then into sort of the social pressures. Absolutely, it's there. But what I think is once you are joining the mom groups and your kids go to preschool, you'll see that those sort of Instagrammable lunches and that kind of thing really are only on social media. And everyone is just in the same boat trying to make sure their kids are dressed and have some food with them when they show up to school. So I think that I have found, maybe it's just the Jewish community that we're in or where we live outside Washington, D.C., but I have not really found the mom battles to be that bad or like the pressure between parents. I think it might be worse in some other cities. Like I'm sure just from my own experience growing up in LA, there's probably more of that there than there is here in DC. But I have found the Jewish moms that I have met to just be so supportive, to just like everyone out there struggling and trying to balance everything, and everyone just appreciates any sort of honesty and reality about what raising kids today is like.
I love it. I find these people I talk to, it's not necessarily an outside pressure, it's an internal one people place on themselves sometimes from seeing things. But I loved what you said about, right, what happens on Instagram isn't the real world. In halakha, we talk about something that's lehatchila or b'diavad, right? Something that from the outset is the best ideal way to practice this, but in a practical world, after the fact, right, boots on the ground, right, whatever's happening, this is, right, the okay level. This is, good enough isn't the right word. It's still within the boundaries of the Jewish law. And I think that is a kind of a halakhic framework of what you're saying of, right, there's maybe this like ideal made up world of, right, perfection that we see online versus just on the ground, right? If your child's happy and clothed and
Right.
loved and, right, these are the things that are the essence of those commandments of being a parent.
Totally. And I often share on a Friday, I'll say, this is what my real Shabbat looks like. So last week it was half a frozen challah taken out of the freezer on a messy countertop with, a Kiddush cup with a grape inside and some Shabbat candles, because that was like the reality of Shabbat. But that's kind of what I always say. It's like, I'd rather my kids see me light candles every Friday night than skip it all the Friday nights that we're actually ordering takeout for dinner. Like, it's fine. We light the candles and we have pizza. It's like at least they're seeing that we're incorporating Shabbat and what we can that works for our family, instead of just kind of dismissing it because it's not the perfect Sabbath. We haven't made matzo ball soup. We haven't honored it. And, of course, the ideal is wonderful. Like, I love to have my home ready for Shabbat and have flowers and everything beautiful. I'm not saying that that is, something that's unattainable and we shouldn't try for, but that the in-between moments, the reality of it are okay too.
I think that goes also to part of the authenticity in the way you connect with people of you give them something that they can live up to. I know for many rabbis I know, even in the conservative movement, right, there's a wide range of views on things like electricity. And I know lots of rabbis that in their home might turn on a light switch or use electricity for different things. But if they ever have congregants over for a meal, or if they ever, right, they would never admit to it in public. I once was at a synagogue where I watched somebody, this is back when I was still a student, and I watched somebody get kind of caught by the rabbi. They went to check their phone in a back hallway, and they looked so guilty as the rabbi walked into the room, and like just awful that they got caught. But then the rabbi went into their office to check their phone for something. And it's not that that isn't keeping Shabbat, but right, there is an idea that electricity in the conservative movement, right, is permitted in certain situations with certain things. And I just find so many Jews, I think Shabbat is just unapproachable, that it means you have to live like you're Amish, that you can't have any technology, you have to sit in the dark or whatever it is, versus I think, right, rabbis could do a better job of showing the ways of kind of, right, not the perfect Shabbat, but a Shabbat that was in line with at least our understanding of halakha and Jewish law. And in that way, right, it's not the perfect Shabbat dinner you're showing your audience, but it's a Shabbat dinner, and it's something that they can live up to, which is, I think it goes a long way to bringing people in.
And my whole thing is that that is still valid, that your Shabbat experience is not any less worthy than the ultra-Orthodox family in the next neighborhood. If it's meaningful to you and your family and brings blessing into your home, then that is the element, the most beautiful element of Shabbat. So that's also what I convey is, or what I try to convey is, it's not just like, okay, let's do the best we can and we'll try harder next week. It's like, this is completely valid and this is all that it needs to be.
So besides authenticity, right, you seem to connect with, right, just right in the title of your book, The Millennials Guide. That's exactly the demographic every synagogue, every major traditional Jewish organization is trying to reach out to, trying to court and bring in. And that really is your audience. And you have not just hundreds, not just thousands, but tens of thousands or more of them that follow you and watch you. So besides authenticity, is there anything else you would put in as your kind of reasons that you're so successful at engaging this group in Jewish life?
I think that there's just not many others out there willing to do it. And, when the pandemic hit and synagogues and Jewish institutions were thinking about how to take content online, it was a lot of this copy paste format. We have, a lecture that meets on Tuesdays at 10. So now the rabbi is going to lecture on Zoom on Tuesdays at 10, which is fine. And that was totally necessary to do. But whenever I spoke to any like congregational leaders, I would say to them, like, you can do so much more now. Like these tools, Instagram, YouTube, are open to everyone. So I said to my rabbi, I said, I think people would love to see you in your home cooking Shabbat dinner. Like, what does your house look like? What does your kitchen look like? What does your wife make for Shabbat dinner? The same things that people are looking to me for, I'm sure they would love to see from, Jewish communal leaders as a way to sort of bring people in. Take us on a shopping trip to this grocery store and show us how you find kosher food. Like, it could be anything that I think people who live a religious life almost take for granted, and like, why would I show what I got at the grocery store, right? If you don't watch YouTube, that's a very, very popular topic, is to do grocery hauls. And I think for people who don't watch YouTube, it's like, why would I care what somebody else bought at the grocery store? But it's just fascinating to see how other people really live. So I always say, like, take your rabbi to show us what he buys at the grocery store every week, or, just find ways to kind of adapt what's working online into the traditional Jewish spaces and see what happens.
I'd be afraid to do that myself, just because I'd have congregants showing up with like vegetables and fruits and
like, you need
all sorts
more
of other
protein.
things. Going, Rabbi, you can't eat any of this junk that you bought online, or that we saw you buying online. I can't believe it. But I think, again, it's that same sense of, right, people want to get to know really who you are. And I think you're absolutely right that I think our institutions can do a better job of showing that side of things than the day-to-day things. Because I know a lot of times when I have conversion students and they're preparing for the mikvah, they are so nervous and freaked out from what they read online, because they find maybe something about, like you said, from Chabad or Aish or somewhere about, right, what happens when you go to an Orthodox mikvah. and they think that someone's going to be there to inspect their body like with a fine-tooth comb and to check everything and all of this. And I have to tell them like, no one's doing that. Like it's going to be okay. But it's not there. It's not available to them. And I think you're right. It's the questions and concerns people have, and that might keep them from engagement in a way if they don't have those kinds of resources.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the mikveh because I did a video on the mikveh, and that one and another one I have called my Jewish home tour are some of my most popular videos because a lot of people have it's like things they've never seen or experienced before that they're like, what goes on there? What is this? And like in the Jewish home one, it's like a lot of people in the world have never been inside a Jewish person's home. So it's fascinating.
I love that even because I have some conversion students that are from places where there aren't a lot of Jews. We take it for granted in cities like Los Angeles, Toronto, or Washington, D.C., that people probably know a Jewish person. But I have some students that come from places that their family really has never met a Jew before. So a video like that, just to be able to show their family back home and reassure them that, right, their world's not radically changed. They're not, wearing black hats and right what they see people see in a TV show or on Netflix. That's not
Right.
what their home's going to look like now when they finally come to visit their child. Uh, I'm curious. You write a lot, right, towards moms, but I'm going to be a new dad, God willing, in August, and I guess my question is, what's your advice for Jewish fathers? Do you have any thoughts on for us?
Yeah. Yeah. So in my book, which I'll give another plug to, there is a chapter on preparing for fatherhood. And we obviously learn in the Torah that a father has responsibilities. He has to teach his child to, he has to give him a bris, he has to, all of the four, things that we know about fatherhood, right? But then there's this question of like, okay, but what else does it mean to be a good Jewish father? And I think that, kind of what we were talking about earlier about this idea of respecting children in a way, caring for them, that those are all beautiful aspects of our culture and tradition, that the father can play such a big role in, especially in imparting Jewish knowledge and Jewish culture. I think it's very hard at the beginning for new dads because the role of the mom is so physical and so physically connected to the baby that it can be hard for the dad to feel like, okay, when's my turn? When do I get to, play a big role here? But I think Jewish men in general, to say something very positive, are very caring and loving, for their wives and for their families. And that like from the first moments, that we see that caring for them, caring for their, wife or partner during pregnancy, even being supportive and nurturing. It's like, I'm so thankful that our culture is very proud and welcoming of fatherhood in a way that's very genteel, very loving. Like, I feel like that's such a natural part of Jewish fatherhood culture. So it's like, I don't know. I think there's so many great examples and things like that in the culture already. It's really nice.
I love that, but just in case my wife Lauren ends up watching this, I'll be there around the bar bat mitzvah, okay? The rest,
My
no.
husband was the same way. He was like, I don't do the babies. I'll wait till they're toddlers. But then, of course, day one, he was, holding him.
I absolutely love kids, and since I was, in seventh grade, ran youth services for younger kids at the synagogue, and couldn't wait at camp to be a counselor, and worked at summer camps. I ended up going to Ramah after a few years, but as a staff person from JCA, but worked at camps until I actually got a full-time job as a rabbi. So my point is, I love youth, but I have no idea how to deal with kids under the age of like 6 because I've just never had to work with them. Maybe a 4-year-old for a Tot Shabbat program, but they have a parent or someone else there as well. So we're going to
Well,
rely on her, but I'm
it's funny
terrified.
though, because even a lot of women these days, like I talk to a lot of moms who the first diaper they change, like I was mentioning about the breast, is their own baby. So a lot of people don't have experience, but I think there's like this really renewed interest in childhood and like childhood psychology and all of that. Someone I always like to talk about is she has an Instagram, Dr. Becky Good Inside, I think is what it is. And she's a psychologist, and she has so much wonderful advice for like tantrums and, everything and anything about early childhood. So yeah, it's like, I think there's it's an aspect of learning. I think that this generation has embraced it as something to learn and research, whereas previous generations were kind of like, oh, we'll just raise them and hope they turn out okay. I think now it's become very popular to actually research like what are the ways to most healthfully and to raise your child in a way that helps their natural development. So there's so much information out there now on these topics.
I think that also in a way speaks to what we were talking about before about Judaism being a way to kind of learn about parenting, because there are fads that come and go in kind of different generations about this is the way to parent, this is the best way, that is the best way. I think certainly in the academic circles like psychology and medicine, they're getting better and better with each generation, learning more, but they're kind of popular methods versus here you're talking about something that's been tried and true for 4,000 years, not something that's just become popular in the last couple of decades as a way that you're bringing people in. One of the things I loved in your book is that it really kind of reaches out to all types of families. You even have things in there for interfaith families, which is a growing demographic in the Jewish world. It's growing quicker in the United States than it is here in Canada, but it's something here in Toronto that I think synagogues and Jewish institutions really need to start to wrestle with. I'm curious what your advice is for grandparents who have grandchildren who are being raised in an interfaith family and concerned. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions?
Yes, so this is very, very popular. I have a lot of grandparents reach out to me. One I want to recommend, in case anyone doesn't know, there's a Facebook group called the Jewish Grandparents Network, that is their total focus, and it's a huge community support for grandparents in that situation. And then I just say, I always preach acceptance and welcoming. And I think that that is the only way with anything your kids do that aren't totally in line with how you would want them to have things go in their life, that is the only way to keep the tradition alive, to keep your, the values, the faith, anything that you want to impart on the next generation is just acceptance and welcoming. The more you can make people feel included and see the beauty of Judaism, then that's only going to help. And to not have it be this all or nothing, right? So I know for a lot of Jewish grandparents, it's like, right, you're supposed to sit Shiva, they married someone who wasn't Jewish and that's it. That's the end of the life, And I think hopefully in this generation, we've kind of seen that actually there are so many interfaith families that have embraced Judaism in a wonderful way, and that their children, if they're included by the Jewish community, have some of the strongest ties to Judaism because they feel like they're kind of choosing it in part and it wasn't forced on them. So I think we've sort of seen the example through the past few generations of the difference between we know, right? If you completely isolate someone and say like what you've done is not acceptable, then they're never going to come back. We know that for sure. So the other example is if we try to be as inclusive as possible, then there's hope that maybe Judaism will be valuable in their life and in their children's lives. So I think it's all about the attitude. And of course, there's some loss and some heartbreak because as a grandparent, you've seen how Judaism has played such a big role in your life and you just want to pass it on, right? There's nothing wrong with feeling that loss. But as much as you can to let that go and then embrace, what you do have, I think is for the better. And to know that there are, yes, so many other people in that same situation as you.
No, certainly there's that sense of loss. I think parents and grandparents picture the future for their child or grandchild. And sometimes when that kid has their own thoughts and dreams and will, it's not a bad thing, but it does take a sense to kind of reorient kind of what your hopes and thoughts were. right? When there's not, you find out it's not going to be a chuppah at the wedding, but you always pictured your grandchild standing under that chuppah someday and things like that. It takes some time to process that, but it's the
Right.
health and wellness that I always try to remind people to focus on. But I loved what you said. I actually spoke a couple of years ago on the high holidays, and to very mixed reviews. There was a demographic that loved it, and a demographic that absolutely thought it was the worst message that could possibly shared. But that we live in a world where so many people who are born of two Jewish parents identify now in their religion as none.
Right.
Right? They pick not Judaism or no religion, versus we see so many families that are interfaith and with a supportive non-Jewish partner, but who's supportive of creating a Jewish home. We see very strong identity, much more so than when one or both parents have just no Jewish identity themselves, passing that on to their children.
Right.
So
And I
I
think,
think
yeah, it's like,
door
it's,
open policy is the way to go, as you're saying. Sorry.
yeah, I was going to say, it's like, you know, you think that they'll never be connected to Judaism. So you've, as a grandparent, lost out on hosting Shabbat dinners and taking your child to touch Shabbat. But if you leave that door open, and say to your children, like, would you like to come once a month on Friday nights for Shabbat dinner? And is it okay if I say the blessings? Because that's what I do in my home. They might be totally open and receptive to it. And then you've given your grandchild a whole upbringing of once a month Shabbat dinners. And if you say to them, Saturday mornings, I know you guys like to go to the gym. Can I take the grandchild to touch Shabbat? It's like, you don't know what doors will open in the future. And just because something is one way when the grandchild is born and parents are of a certain mind of things, you never know what can happen. So that's also kind of thus the advice that I give. And obviously it's so easy for me to say this as a Jewish mom. I'm not a grandparent yet. Who knows what my children will do with their futures, but that's just the advice I give as someone who's not there and hasn't experienced it, but has seen kind of the results of it.
One of the people you mentioned in your book, you bring actually a lot of great teachers and experts into your book. One of them you mentioned, I didn't realize that he had actually on your wedding, is Rabbi Ed Feinstein, who was our guest earlier in this season of the show.
I'm a
He's one of
huge
my
fan.
teachers in rabbinical school. I'm a huge fan as well. And what you quoted him in there was something along the lines of saying that, right, all families in a sense are interfaith because they're bringing different views and different kind of customs and traditions in. And I see this even in families where there's two Jews. There's a grandparent that wants them over at Shabbat every week, but the family, has other things. They have other in-laws to go to and to be with, and also sometimes some personal time as well as a family is necessary, or a quiet Shabbat with a grape and a frozen challah and some takeout sometimes is just what a family needs. So I think it's absolutely true. You have to find these different balances and just keep the door open for when people are there without putting too much pressure, because nothing
Right.
pushes someone away more than pressure. I'm
For sure.
curious, in terms of Jewish identity in general, because as we said, right, we're seeing a lot of people are growing up and falling into this category of none, right? And even if they've had day school education or summer camp or gone on Israel trips, we're still seeing a lot of people that grow up with very little to no connection to Jewish life or tradition or the teachings. Curious if you have any kind of advice for parents specifically on that, of how can you cultivate a strong Jewish identity in your child?
So I think your child has to see that it's valuable to you and to your family, but to also, like anything that you're trying to impart to them, to make it a blessing in their life. So if your child hates Hebrew school, forcing them there every day, every week is not going to help the situation. Is there a different way that they could experience a Jewish education that works for them? I think it's all about adapting to the child. I think we've kind of gone away from this like one size fits all approach. And I think for me, even with my little ones, I think like, have I done enough to, to share Judaism with them this week, kind of thing. But it takes time to sort of reflect on that. Like, they're in Jewish nursery school. Okay, so I've ticked that off, but it's easy to be kind of complacent and be like, okay, that's it. I've done my job now. So I really just kind of reflect on it like I do with any other aspect of motherhood, like, kind of how am I doing? How are the tantrums going? How's the eating going? All of that, to kind of say like, you know what? We haven't really had a nice Shabbat dinner this summer yet. Like, let me try and focus on that in the next week. So I think it's just taking the time really to try and make sure it's incorporated into your family in a way that's benefiting the children.
I think what you said about showing them yourself that it's something of value is so important, because I remember as a Hebrew school teacher, I had so many kids who got dropped off there, and I would tell them about, this is what you do on Shabbat, or that, or this is holidays, and they never heard of some of these holidays. They've never seen some of them practice. They've never experienced them. Their parents sent them to get an education, but don't do any of those things at home, and that it sends very different messages. It doesn't send the message, this is important, dropping your kid off and not partaking as well in some of these at home.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, it's like you expect your kids to be studying Judaism, 2 hours a week, but like, when's last time you read a Jewish book or, listened to a Jewish podcast? Or like I talk about, how many Jewish people do you follow on social media? Around December, are you only seeing Christmas decorations on your Instagram feed? Like, could you follow a few more, Jewish families or things like that, so that you're also being influenced and learning just in the way that you are influenced and learning throughout all your life, reading books, listening to podcasts, going on social media, make sure that there's some Jewish aspects there too, so that you're also learning, and it being influenced in that way.
Actually, it just reminds me, as you mentioned, right around, do you see a lot of Christmas or Hanukkah things? It reminded me, I think it was in your book, although I've watched a lot of your content in the last couple of weeks to prepare for this, so I could be wrong, but I think you talked there about how you've tried to make Hanukkah really fun because your kids, see everyone else. And I remember as a kid myself seeing everyone decorating their house, and how sad it made me that I didn't get to do that. But you talked about kind of making Hanukkah a little bit more of a spectacle and really going all out with the decorations, so they get some of that joy of bringing light into the home.
Totally. I mean, and this is very different from the previous generation. The way I was raised, Hanukkah was not the Jewish Christmas, and it absolutely was not going to be a wonderful day in that aspect. Like Rosh Hashanah and Pesach were the big holidays. And so, my parents, it was like, to spite Christmas, we were going to not make Hanukkah a big deal. But I'm of the total opposite mindset. And I want Hanukkah to be as wonderful and as exciting as possible. Although I know in reality, like, nothing can compete with Christmas. But I don't like the idea of setting something up in that, if you're feeling like, I wish I could partake in something during around that time, which is totally normal because the entire world seems to be caught up in it, then how about if we make Judaism something that can help ease some of that pain and some of that wanting, right? Instead of like, let's go to Disneyland or let's do something secular to make up for the fact that we don't get to do what other people are doing. How about if Judaism can provide the answer to that? So that's sort of how I see it. It's an experiment in the works, but to me, I just enjoy it too. I love decorating for Hanukkah and making it fun in my home. So that's what we're doing for us.
I love that. I think my wife also would love that, because she actually converted to Judaism. And for her, it's one of the hardest parts was thinking about those family moments that she had of decorating the home and all of that she's not going to get to share with her own kid, which were some of the most meaningful moments of her own childhood, getting to do that with her parents.
Right.
So I think we might be stealing some of this for the Sachs household ourselves when it comes to really trying to make Hanukkah something big like that.
Right.
One of the videos you put out recently, I think I saw it on your Instagram, was about talking to kids about God, which I think is so important. I think as Jews in general, we do a bad job talking about God. It seems like a Christian world thing. Jews kind of don't mention God very much at all. But I know for me, God is the basis of why we do different mitzvot or why we go to prayer. And I think adults need to talk more about God, because people say prayer doesn't connect to me, but I ask them, who are they praying to? If they believe in a person that's listening, or they're praying to the universe, or they're praying, all of that shapes everything we do. And I think it really starts with childhood, because kids grow up hearing about the Torah, but then they get to university, and even before that, they figure out that the Garden of Eden story might not be how the rest of the world views the creation of the world, and how,
Right.
what they're learning in academia and in school. And it kind of makes the Torah then get written off as this book of stories, right? It doesn't, and we don't give them a stronger, a more adult, a more nuanced approach. I think rabbinical students talk about it, but beyond that, I don't know there's much talk and rabbis talk about it in the Jewish world, and there's much talk about other ways of understanding what the Torah is or what God is than just the figure as it's given in these early stories in Genesis. So I'm curious, like, how do you approach talking to God about talking to your kids about God?
Yeah. Well, I think what's, wonderful, but also very difficult about the Jewish understanding of God is there isn't one clear, definition of exactly what God's doing all day and how he's impacting our life. And, every Jewish person has a different, slightly different view of how that works. And so as parents, it's like, we don't want to, force our children's way of thinking into some narrow view that's not going to hold out for the rest of their life. So I think for me, like, one of the books that really changed my view of God and was one of the first books that actually resonated with me in a way that, like, okay, this makes sense, was Harold Kushner's When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And that was really a fundamental change in how I had seen God in Judaism. And that influences me now in how we talk about God in our family. But I think you're right. If you totally avoid the topic, and naturally for Jews, that's easy to do, right? In a lot of Jewish circles, then it's going to be difficult for your kids to kind of form it completely on their own. And then you're relying on what they might pick up from Hebrew school or other places as being their only fundamental understanding. So I think when there's big moments in life, like wonderful things happen to us, or terrible things happen to us, like that's a natural time to talk about faith in God. And so that's kind of how we approach it in our home. But it's funny you're talking about how it's like kind of Christian to talk about God, it seems almost, even though God is so fundamental to Judaism. But it was around the holidays. I followed a Christian woman, and they get all the Christmas cards from other families, and her boys every night would take one holiday card and pray for that family, which is kind of like a very Christian thing to do. It just made me laugh. I was like, no, that's just not a Jewish thing to do. Although there's nothing about praying for a family that's not Jewish, but it's just funny that Christians, the way they teach prayer and God to their children, is a very much more like direct, they feel like they have nothing to hide almost, like it's part of their everyday life. We're going to pray to God. And I think in some Orthodox circles, it's also the same way. It's like a given. But we're kind of left in this in between because we know Judaism allows us to be very open with our understanding of what God is, but then it, like I said, makes it so difficult to then teach that truth, whatever that truth may be, to our children. So yes, it's a very difficult thing. But again, I would just say, like, I just try to think about it. And like, that's my whole goal of motherhood, is to be intentional and conscious with what I'm doing. So if I've thought about it this week, then when I'm living my life and something comes up, something will hit me. It's like, I don't have to have all the answers. I just remember, like, okay, like, maybe there's a way to talk about God. And then the next day something will happen. I'll be like, this is it. This is where I want to talk about something like this. So again, it's just having that conscious awareness throughout parenthood, really, I think is the key.
Anyone that's watching that watched our last week's episode, we had Rabbi Dr. Devorah Schoenfeld on, who's a professor at a Catholic university, but an ordained Orthodox female rabbi. And I had her as an undergraduate professor in a Bible studies class. So one of the things we talked about is, in the Christian world, there's much more of this praise God, this kind of willingness to just kind of shout out and have those personal contacts, versus in the Jewish world, it does feel less so. Even things we talked about if I said, our Father who art in heaven, you'd look at me like, I'm not a rabbi, but it's Avidu Shabbat Shemayim. We say it every week on Shabbat in our prayer for Israel and in other parts of the Siddur. But it's just that we don't necessarily do that translation, that thinking of things. But
Mm-hmm.
um, one of the best teachings about teaching kids about God I've ever found is Rabbi Harold Schulweis, who is
Oh, and
I'm a big fan
go
of. I don't know if you're
VBS.
familiar.
Yeah.
Is that where you grew up? That's why you had Rabbi
Yeah.
Feinstein then. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know if you are familiar, maybe experienced it yourself then as a child there when he was still alive and teaching. But in his book, he talks about how when kids, struggle with the idea of something that exists, but you can't feel it or touch it or necessarily experience, he always used the analogy of, your parents' love, which I like. The idea that, right, they know that their parents' love is real, but they can't necessarily see it or feel it or touch it the same way they can their nose or their ears or their chin, and trying to use that as a jumping off point for things that exist, but we can't necessarily sense in the same way, which leads to how do you sense God and all of that, which is one of the things I've encouraged grandparents here at the shul who are looking for ways to talk to their kids about God. But also, I highly recommend Marion's page as well if you're looking for other tips and tricks for this or really anything else. There's so much on there, from, like she said, home organization to real practical ways of celebrating holidays and everything in between. Before we end, I just wanted to ask if there is. Actually, I have two questions because do you have still a few more minutes? So I just
Yeah,
realized I
sure.
forgot. I wonder, how did you end up going from the internet, from video form to a written form? What made the jump for you?
So I actually, yeah, I started writing the book at the same time I started my YouTube channel. It's just amazing that this takes years and YouTube videos, you could just pop up any minute. So I started at the same time because, again, it was that researching about the bris. And I realized that in the same way for pregnancy, this collection of information did not exist in one place. There was no sort of resource. So the book, it looks like kind of like, a fiction but it's what it is. It's more like a guide, like what to expect when you're expecting. It's trimester by trimester breakdown of how Judaism can be involved throughout the different processes. And especially infertility, loss, like all of those topics where people really cling to faith, there was no one spot to go for it. So it's sort of similar to the YouTube journey. It was like, I need to collect this information and just put it in one place for people. So that's how that came about. It just took so much longer.
It's funny, right? A child goes from a single cell to a full grown baby in 9 months, versus
Right.
a book is a much more detailed process, but it really does come through. To everybody watching, I highly recommend Expecting Jewish. It is, if
Thank
you
you.
are new to parenthood or soon to be parent or hoping to be a parent or a grandparent looking for tips or tricks to pass along or as a gift for somebody. It is really a wonderful book that, as Marion said, it's everything from infertility issues to right parenthood. It covers all the different things that a new mom or dad might need to learn. So, highly recommend it. Before we let you
Thank
leave
you.
us, can you share with us just a teaching, a piece of Torah, some Jewish teaching that for you personally has been significant and meaningful?
Yes. So for me, the one that guides me throughout my journey as a mom and just in life in general is the Jewish value of B'Tselem Elohim, that we're all created in God's image. So the reason I keep this in mind is that for me, it helps me to feel worthy and special, and that I have a unique place in this world and a unique voice and something to offer. So any time that I'm feeling down and like, you know, at my wits' end in the parenthood journey, I remember that I'm here, I'm created in God's image, and only I can do this life of mine. And it also helps me to impart that same sense of worth and value to my children, to let them know that they are special, that they're here for a beautiful reason, that they're created in God's image. And it also is kind of it makes me laugh sometimes. Your kids will do things that you're like, where did that come from? Like, how is this my child? Where did they learn this? Why are they like this? And then also a frustrating way, like, why are they like this? Why do they do these things? And it just is that kind of reminder, like, we're all in God's image, even during the frustrating times, that there is a spark of divinity within us all. So that is what kind of guides me and what I keep in my mind throughout my life.
I love that. I have a sense, you hear me if I'm wrong, that as a parent, there are a few of those occasions that come up where you need that kind of encouragement. All my friends who had kids talk about what a blessing, a miracle, it's so wonderful, until my wife and I announced that she was pregnant, and now it's a lot of, oh boy, are you in for it? Woo! So
Yeah,
key things like that to help carry us through the tough moments to what really is the blessings of being a parent.
right.
I can only assume, to be honest, at this point, but I'm looking forward to them, and I'm looking forward to using some of your wisdom to help guide me. I want to
Thank
thank
you.
you so much for being on the program. I've just been thinking to myself about how I think there are many answers you gave that I very much resonate with. And I think a lot of that is because even though, right, you're not ordained as a rabbi, even back at camp, you were one of my rabbis. You were
Aw,
one of my teachers and one of those people that helped influence me at a very pivotal time in my life and my Jewish identity. So I want to
I
thank you for sharing
appreciate
your
that.
Torah with us. And to anybody who wants to learn more or hear more from Marion, you can get her book. You can find her online on YouTube, My Jewish Mommy Life, or on our website or on Instagram as well. And we really hope you enjoyed tonight's program and hope you'll be back for another week of learning with my rabbis. Have a great night.
Don't love God. If you don't love your neighbor, if you gossip about him, if you never have mercy, if he gets into trouble and you don't try